Thank you so much for coming. You all are on the live stream now. My speaker's out of control. Yes, thank you so much for coming, and we are really glad you all are here. So we are just going to have a brief teach out for the next 1 hour and how she will speak, and then we will have a chance for questions and answers and some discussion as well. So just start off with Ambika Satyanathan, who is going to talk about state insecurity and the economic crisis.
Sure.
Thanks, Ambika.
Actually, so I thought first, wow, we talk about national security because that is something, a phrase that is always thrown about, right? And so when you hear the word phrase national security, what normally people think of wars, they think of terrorism, they think of conflict, they think someone is attacking them. That's the notion. The notion that states, governments want you to have in your head about what national security is. So in the name of national security, what happens is that there are laws. There are laws in our country, there are laws in many other countries. They tend to be also very restrictive. They tend to be. Now, the government say that they have brought about these laws for your protection. But what it actually does is, if it violates or it restricts human rights, it ends up making all of us very insecure. And I think this is something that we have seen the last few weeks in relation to the protest. Now, there are three elements I would like to mark. One, all of you would have heard of because it happened very recently, which is the state of emergency. Everyone's heard of the state of emergency.
Are you okay to bring the mask? Yeah, because it's not the same. Yeah, it's all perfect now. Sorry.
So, so it's the state of emergency, which all of you have heard of. The next one is the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Now, that is also something that some of us have been talking about for decades, but you would have heard it also because it came up in relation to the Nirvana protest, right? And the other one is the role of the police and the military. Now, the linchpin here is, you may not know it, an element that holds all of this together, the presidency. So the question is, how does the executive presidency, what is its influence, what is its power? The first is the president is the armed forces, is the commander in chief, and also because of the 20th Amendment, he's also, now the 19th Amendment did not actually allow for that, but the 20th Amendment, it did away with that, so therefore he appointed himself as Minister of Defense. So how is a state emergency declared? Does anyone know? Was that the first time that you all have heard about the state of emergency? Had you heard about it before? COVID. So COVID was the first time. Before that, no. Correct. Because in Sri Lanka, since our independence, I think we've spent more years, the majority of our history, post-independent history, the time, we have spent under a state of emergency. How is a state of emergency declared and who has the power to declare it? We have a law which was drafted in 1947. The left parties were actually very concerned about this. Why? Because they thought it was to cut down on trade union activities, their protests. But what if you look through history, the left parties themselves, when they came into power, what did they? They had no problem with the law. They actually used the law themselves, right? So under the Public Security Ordinance, the president, under Section 2, has the power to declare a state of Now, the state of emergency can be declared, I'm kind of reading verbatim, if it's expedient to do presidents of the opinion. So it's very subjective. It is not objective. There are no objective factors. The law does not define state of emergency. So it's all based on subjective factors. The president is of the opinion that it's expedient to do so in the interest of security and the preservation of public order, or for the maintenance of supplies and services essential to the life of the community. Now, once that is declared, immediately inform the Parliament, and within 14 days, the Parliament must take a vote. After, if they vote it in, then every month they have to vote it. So the Parliament is actually supposed to be a check on the declaration of emergency. Now, at the time when they when amendments were made, there was a point at which they said, it exists for more, I think it was 6 months, then you need 2/3 to pass it. But it was rejected. That couldn't hold to that. Right? So now, according to international standards, there are certain elements that have to be present before a state of emergency is declared. Now, the state of emergency, but it must actually be happening, or it must be imminent, like there are factors that make you feel open to happen. It can't be prevented. You think, oh, well, this might happen, so let me declare it. No, it can't be prevented. And also, it should be of a magnitude that affects country. And thirdly, it must affect the nation has to be threatened. So the territorial integrity, like if someone is attacking, those elements must be under threat. And also, the crisis or danger must be exceptional, that the normal measures can't be applicable. So you need to resort to this. And also, it should be the last resort, and it should be a temporary measure. You can ask yourself whether, when this state of emergency was declared recently, whether any of these factors were there. No, were they there? So therefore, to declare or not. Now, what happens when a state of emergency is declared? After the state of emergency is declared, the president has the power to issue emergency regulations. Now, what do these regulations do? They actually restrict our rights. They can. For instance, in the 90s, there was a particular regulation which said that if someone died in police custody, they could actually dispose of them without following normal procedure. Yes, there was. They have had restrictions where they've said in the past that you can do certain things without the approval of the competent authority. They appoint someone as the competent authority and you have to get approval. Or restrictions regarding public gathering. So it restricts your rights. And also sometimes it gives extra powers to the police, to the military, powers, additional powers. So that is what emergency regulations do. Now, the strange thing is that when they declare the state of emergency this time, they did issue emergency regulations. So to me, actually, it didn't make sense, because emergency regulations are what allow you to exercise powers to do something under the state of emergency. Without that, I frankly didn't see the point of it. Now, of course, they could issue regulations literally like the next minute, as long as the state of emergency is in place. So maybe they meant to, no. But once again, this restriction of rights is it's not blanket. Certain rights cannot be restricted under any circumstances, like the right to life, protection against torture, because that is what's called customary international law. It is accepted that all countries accept it, that everyone, that it has those rights. So that you cannot. In legal language, we call it derogate. That's the fancy word. But it means you don't adhere to those rights and you move away from them and you rescind them. So even there, the UN Human Rights Committee has set out things like it has to be proportional, that it can't discriminate. So if they pass an emergency regulations that discriminate community, like let's say important, a grave and imminent threat to the life of the nation cannot justify these derogatory, what we call these restrictions. So with these, you yourself can analyze the state of emergency that is passed. You can think, okay, if emergency regulation, would they have adhered to these international principles? This was, of course, set out by the UN Human Rights. Now, as I said earlier, you would remember it has to be presented to Parliament in 14 days, and the Parliament has to vote on it. What is the purpose of that? It is to ensure that the executive doesn't run riot, that the Parliament acts as a check. But looking at our history, has it acted as a check? If you look at votes, parliamentary votes on states of emergency, you will see that when the opposition was barely present and the state of emergency was passed with very few votes, which means if the opposition is in history, several years, like if the opposition had mobilized and they had voted against it, at that time they could have defeated the state of emergency very easily. But often they were passed with very small number of votes. So the Parliament didn't actually act as a check. So you have heard of this very renowned Sri Lankan anthropologist, Professor Karnamaka. So in 1984, mind you, he predicted this. He said that because of also the executive presidency, soon what we will have is a Parliament does not represent the people, but instead represents the president. Now, this is something that we have seen time and again. That's why these huge majorities are also valid. Any party, like when they have 5/6 majority or 2/3 majority in Parliament, what did we see? We saw the same thing, that the Parliament became subordinate to the executive instead of being a check on the executive. Now, once again, with the 20, we see the same thing happen. Then there is another section. Now, this is something that I personally have been shouting about and no one paid any attention. But it is another section in the Public Security Ordinance, Section 12. It is actually most people ignore. It allows the president, if he thinks there is an imminent threat, and he thinks that the police can't face that threat, he can call out the armed forces for what's called maintenance of law and order. Something President Chandrika Kumaratunga used, President Mahinda Rajapaksa used this, President Sirisena used this, and then and then soon after he came to power, President Rajapaksa also used it. This is technically, it gives him unlimited power. Every month, all that he has to do is just pass a gazette. That's all. He doesn't have, he just says you have to inform Parliament, but even if you don't, nothing happens. Parliament doesn't have to vote on it. So every month, you can just wake up and say, okay, and that's exactly what's been happening. So without all of you knowing, the past, how many years? 1.5 years, every month, the military has had the power to engage in activities related to law and order. But no one knew about it. The last of this gazette was last time it was on 21st of March, which means it's coming up, right? And we don't most likely, we don't know, but most likely we will issue it again. So I was saying that is also something that we agitate about, because that is worse than a state of emergency, because it goes unnoticed. It is not debated in Parliament. Parliament doesn't have to vote on it. So in a way, you get it without any oversight, right? It also it allows them the power to arrest people, and if the military arrests people, they don't have to immediately give them to the police. It just says you need to hand them over to the police without unnecessary delay. I don't know what is necessary delay, right? And it also they can disperse any unlawful assembly of five or more persons that is likely to cause disturbance. So you can see how even when there is no state of emergency can be used to break up peaceful protests. Five or more people. Right now they could just come and say this. Right? Of course, it wouldn't be objective to international standards, etc. But they can still use that. Then, of course, we move to the PTA. Have you heard of the Prevention of Terrorism Act? Now, there also the role of the president is very important. Now, that is something I think that gives you more security. But you saw that after the Iran protest, that day morning, the lawyer, someone who used to work with me, was one of the first who was at the Mariana police station. He called me that morning, and he said, we talked to them several times. They keep telling us that a charge will under what do we do? And that is when even I tweeted, because I wanted it to get a lot of visibility. And that went on. Only around midday they said, okay, it's not the PTA, but you can see how the PTA was about to be abused. Now, what's the role of the president here? The Minister of Defense has a lot of power under the PTA, right? After the 20th Amendment, the agency, and as we know, the president is Minister of Defense. So the president has a lot of power under the PTA. The PTA is something where arrest without warrant, you can detain a person for 72 hours without producing before the magistrate, you can issue, the Minister of Defense can issue a detention order, and you can detain a person for 18 months without producing the person before a magistrate. Also, any confession assistant superintendent of this order can be used as evidence in a trial against. Now, I have seen many files where the only means of evidence was the confession. That was it. There is no other evidence. Now, how did they get this confession? Most often through torture. And when I was at the Human Rights Commission, we did a national study of prisons. We spoke with, I think, nearly 80% of the people who are in prison under the PTA. We found 84% of them told us that they had been tortured. Out of that, 90% of them said they had been tortured because to force them to give confessions. Out of the 90%, 95% told us that they were forced to sign that were in Sinhala, a language they did not understand. Right? So here also you can see how the 20th, anyway, the peace is a law that does not adhere to human rights standards. But you can see the role that the president plays in it, because also of the fact that the 20th took away that protection and he has taken it upon himself to be the Minister of Defense. So once again, that link about how this powerful executive president is a problem, and all these are keeping him safe, are actually making the government more insecure and safe for us. And also we see now that the PTA, for instance, is it's being used against civil. Now, many of the civil society organizations, particularly in the north and east, are often summoned to the terrorism investigation department. And they want to question them. And there is no prime evidence that they've done anything wrong. There is no reasonable suspicion even, but they use the PTA to call them. So what's a form of harassment, intimidation? The other thing that they can label you a terrorist. We saw what happened to the protesters, right? First you're extremist, then you're terrorist, right? So when you immediately labeling someone a terrorist creates fear. They think, oh my God, they're going to use the against me, which means I can be in some place for 18 months without even being produced before the magistrate. That is an amendment which might improve it, but not so much. That's a whole other thing I don't want to also take up. And there are also, under the PTA, they've issued last year in March what are called de-radicalization regulations. I don't know whether you've heard of them. They are very broad and basically give them broad powers to arrest people if you think you have like, it's like in a way also thought policing. And they can, without a trial on the recommendation of the Attorney General, they can send rehabilitation, right? So that also violates your right to fair trial. So as I said, there's also a strong connection between the state of emergency and also police and militarization. Because you see, as the gazette that I mentioned before, also enables the military to engage in a lot of that. This is something that has been happening in the north and the east, where they've been engaged in many of the civilian activities. So once again, this is something that the presidency played a key role in the militarization as well. So I think the other thing I want to say is, if we're talking about also the economy, about the budget. Last year for this year, the military budget went up 14%. But for the health, the budget allocation came down in the middle of a pandemic, right? And now the justice that they give for engaging the military in all this is that they are shit. But I would actually ask all of the reports of the Auditor General. I've also been tweeting about this. So the Auditor General has found a lot of financial mismanagement, possible misappropriation in the military. I'd just like to quickly read some and then stop. They bought 106,460 file covers for 50 million rupees. Only one supplier sent a quotation that was in violation of the government procurement guidelines. And this supplier was known to have engaged in fraud before. But still they gave it to that supplier. Then they bought musical instruments, 36.13 million for 20 regiments. Once again, in violation of procurement guidelines, the urgent requirement for the victory parade in 2010. But 18 regiments failed to receive the instruments before the victory parade. Right? They paid 4.9 million. They overpaid it because they gave to the highest bidding, the bidder, not the lowest. Right? Now this is your law. It's all in the report. Right? And they provide evidence of their various transactions. So there was a lot of difference. There was a 7 billion difference observed between the value presented and what they have. So these are all, I think, raising questions that we don't have enough. Now, these are audit reports. These should have been debated in Parliament, but they are not. So the ministry often, we don't have enough democratic oversight. The government is very hazy. You don't find even parliamentarians, opposition parliamentarians, who want questions. They're often very reluctant, very frightened to do this. So I think to ask also is what does national security mean? It is not just these laws, it is not milk. It's also your right to food, your right to have, right to education, your right to health. Now, because you don't have access to it, you are using your right to protest, right? Your right to defend. But what are they doing? They're using these national security laws, which are to also fit your right to protest to get those other rights. So I think we need to also think of national security in a much broader and deeper way.
Thank you, Ambika.
Oh my God.
Oh, we have the live stream, so do you want to give us a, how do you feel?
Okay. அதாவது தேசிய பாதுகாப்பு அரசாங்கங்களை பொறுத்தவரை தேசிய பாதுகாப்பு சொல்லி எத்தனையோ மனித உரிமைகளை கட்டுப்படுத்துகிற மனித உரிமைகளை மீறுகிற சட்டங்களை கொண்டு வருகிறார்கள். இவர்கள் பிரஜைகளின் உரிமைகளை மீறுவதால் அவர்களுக்கு ஒரு பாதுகாப்பு இன்மையைத்தான் கொண்டு வருகின்றது. அதாவது அவசர கால நிலைமையை பிரகடனப்படுத்துவதை பற்றி நான் கதைத்தேன். அது எப்படி பிரகடனப்படுத்துவது, இதில் வந்து ஜனாதிபதிக்கு இருக்கும் அந்த பங்கு, அவரின் அதிகாரம் என்ன, எப்படி இந்த நிறைவேற்ற அதிகாரம் வந்து ஜனாதிபதி கொடுக்கப்பட்ட அதிகாரத்தை வந்து துஷ்பிரயோகப்படுத்துவதற்கு வந்து இடம். மற்றது இரண்டாவதாக பயங்கரவாத தடை சட்டத்தை பற்றி நான் கதைத்தேன். அதிலும் ஜனாதிபதியின் பங்கு என்ன. பயங்கரவாத தடை சட்டம் என்பது அமைச்சருக்கு தான் அதிகாரத்தை கொடுக்கின்றது. 20வது திருத்த சட்டம் வந்து அந்த 19வது திருத்த சட்டம் ஜனாதிபதி வந்து பாதுகாப்பு அமைச்சரை வந்து அவர் வந்து கையில் வைத்துக் கொள்ள முடியாது. ஆனால் 20வது திருத்த சட்டத்தின் படி வந்து ஜனாதிபதி எந்த அமைச்சையும் வந்து அவர் வகிக்கலாம். ஆகையால் தற்போது வந்து பாதுகாப்பு அமைச்சராக வந்து ஜனாதிபதி இருக்கின்றார். ஆகையால் பயங்கரவாத தடை சட்டத்திலையும் அதை துஷ்பிரயோகம் வந்து ஜனாதிபதி பங்கு வந்து உள்ளது. மூன்றாவதாக இந்த ராணுவமயமாக்கல், இதில் வந்து ஜனாதிபதியின் பங்கு என்றால் ராணுவத்தில் வந்து அந்த அதுவும் அவசர கால நிலையை பிரகடனப்படுத்துவதாலும் பயங்கரவாத தடை சட்டத்தை பாதிப்பதாலும் அந்த மற்ற ராணுவமயமாக்கலில் ஜனாதிபதியின் பங்கு என்ன என்பதை பற்றி தான் நான் இவ்வளவு நேரம் கதைத்தேன். அதாவது அவர் முக்கிய பங்கு வகிக்கின்றார். ஆகையால் நாம் வந்து இந்த தேசிய பாதுகாப்பு என்றால் என்ன என்பதை பற்றி நாம் ஒரு பரந்த நோக்கு போடும். அதாவது இது வந்து ராணுவத்தை வந்து கொண்டு வருவதோ அல்ல இந்த மாதிரியாக மனித உரிமைகளை கட்டுப்படுத்துகிற சட்டங்களை கொண்டு வருவதோ அல்ல. பாதுகாப்பு என்பது மக்களின் வந்து பொருளாதார சமூக உரிமைகள், அதாவது உணவுக்கான உரிமை, கல்விக்கான உரிமை, சுகாதாரத்துக்கான உரிமை, அந்த உரிமைகளும் உள்ளடக்கப்பட வேண்டும். என்றால் மக்கள் அந்த உரிமைகள் மீறப்படுவதாக ஈடுபடுகிறார்கள். ஆனால் இந்த சட்டங்களை பாவித்து மக்களின் போராட்டங்களை முடக்க அவர் பார்க்கிறார்கள் அரசாங்கம். ஆகையால் நாம் வந்து பொது பாதுகாப்பு, தேசிய பாதுகாப்பு என்றால் உண்மையாக மக்களுக்கு பாதுகாப்பு அளிக்க வேண்டும். அதை பற்றித்தான் நான்
நன்றி. Prominent Sikkim? Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Ambika. So now we have Kaushalya Pereira, who is going to talk about an unequal education system and today's crisis. How she will speak in Sinhala?
Thank you, Sachini, for inviting me. I just want to know can everybody back here?
I mean, I can use the megaphone. No?
But let's see. I'd like to ask you to come close if you can. But okay. And if you, at some point, if you don't hear me, just wave at me and I'll tell you that you can't hear. I want to, actually, before I start, I want to apologize for not being able to do this in all 3 languages because I'm very aware that it says unequal education. And I'm only speaking in Sinhala, but we do work with in a multilingual country with very bad language. So I just want to say, if we want to have a session on the politics of language, please say Sachini, and we can do that also. පටන් ගන්න ඉස්සෙල්ලා මම කියන්න කැමති අසමාන අධ්‍යාපනය ගැන කතා කරනකොට භාෂා දෙකකින් විතරක් කතා කරපුවා විශ්වාසයක් තියෙන දෙයක් කියලා මට තේරෙනවා. ඒකින්ද දැන් අපි උපභාෂාවක් බහුභාෂා සංදර්භයක වුණාට අපේ ඇත්තටම භාෂා ප්‍රතිපත්ති හරිම ලංකාවේ භාෂා ප්‍රතිපත්ති එච්චර හරි නෑ. ඒක ගැන වෙනම කතා කරන්න කැමති නම් සචීට කියන්න මම ඔයගලන්ට ආරාධනා කරනවා. To start today's discussion, I ask you just something that I have been thinking about. I just want to know if you have been thinking about it as well. කතාව පටන් ගන්න මම කැමති අහන්න ඔයගලන්ට මම ගොඩක් හිතපු දෙයක් මේක වෙනකොට ඔයගොල්ලොත් ඒක හිතන්න ඇති සමහරට I started wondering how did we come to this place, right? How did we could we have stopped it before? මෙතෙන්ට ඉස්සෙල්ලා අපි කොහොමද මේක නවත්තගන්නේ? ඒ කියන්නේ දැන් අපි කොච්චර දේවල් දන්නේ නේ? ඒ කියන්නේ අඩු ගානේ අවුරුදු දෙක මම දැනගෙන හිටියේ නේ අපිට හැමදාම උයන්න අවශ්‍ය කහ ටික ලංකාවේ විකුණන්නේ නැහැ කියලා. Right? I didn't realize we need turmeric every day in this country, in every household, that we needed to get it from outside, right? I didn't know how much needed, like for what we needed fuel. For example, when the news alert says because of a lack of fuel, we won't be, I didn't know why that was. I didn't know, for example, thinking how could we have held our representatives accountable? කොහොමද අපි වගකීම වන්නේ අපේ අපි අවුරු වන්තිය, right? Then if you think of social media, for example, we are well known as a case of massive amount of hate speech, right? Godak, what's the word for hate speech? හිංසාකාරී භාෂා ආවිෂ්ඨ කරනවා කියලා අපේ social media ඇතම වෙන රටවල් වල සෑහෙන ප්‍රසිද්ධයි. අපි කොහොමද මෙතෙන්ට ආවේ, right? I kept thinking about that. මම ගොඩක් අපි හිතපු දෙයක්. and ඒක මම අපි කොහොමද මේක වෙනස් කරන්නේ? අපිට මොනවද අවශ්‍ය මේක වෙනස් කරන්න? කොහොමද අපි රටක් අපිට අපි තමන්ට වග කියන තමන් අනිත් අයව වග කියවන්න පුළුවන් රටක් හදන්න. Build a country that is accountable to ourselves, to each other, that the country, we are all accountable, that we hold people accountable. How do we build that country? How do we build a country that is not so racist, right? කොහොමද අපි මෙච්චරම මේ අපේ ජාතිවාදීකම නැති කරන්න බැරිව නම් අඳුම කරන්න පුළුවන් රටක් කොහොමද අපි ගොඩනගන්නේ? And there is one institution where we all go to from childhood to early adulthood, right? අපි හැමදාම අවුරුදු 12 චූටි කාලේ ඉඳන් තරුණ වයස වෙනකල්ම ඉස්කෝලේ යනවා, right? Should that not be the place that teaches us these things, right? Should we not be able to get an education where we are not just taught history and economics and mathematics, but also taught about its use in the hour, right? සාමාන්‍යයෙන් කරන අපේ තියෙන ගණන් හදන විතරක් නෙවෙයි අපිට ලෝකෙට අදාළ වෙන්නේ. අපි කොහොමද, how do we build this country where you see that something wrong, you don't just wait, right? How do we become educated so that we are not taking also just waiting silently when somebody else is doing it? අපි කොහොමද මේ කවුරු හරි තව කෙනෙක්ට ජරාව දෙනකොට සබ්ජෙක්ට් බලාගෙන ඉන්නේ එක්කෝ මම කරන්න යනකොට අනිත් එක්කෙනා කරන එක ගැන මම මුකුත් කියන්නේ අපි කොහොමද එහෙම සමාජයක් ගොඩනගන්නේ මේ අධ්‍යාපනය හරහා, right? But for that we need an education system that can do this, right? ඒකට අපිට ඒක කරන්න පුළුවන් අධ්‍යාපන පද්ධතියක් අවශ්‍යයි. ඒ අධ්‍යාපන පද්ධතියක් ගැන ඇත්තටම අන්තිමට බැලුවහම අපිට ඒක කරන්න පුළුවන් ගුරුවරු සමූහයක් අවශ්‍යයි. We need teachers who can do that. Now I know that we have all had inspiring teachers, right? Everyone has had at least one inspiring teacher, right? හැමෝම නිකන් ආකාර විදිහකට වග කියන්න පුළුවන් එක ටීචර් කෙනෙක් ඉඳලා තියෙනවනේ අතුස්සක් බාන්න, right? At least one, right? But imagine if we could. I'm a bit worried now. I don't see nods. No, not that way when I was watching. No, I don't think it's more like
with us, but I won't say inspiring in that sense, who really taught us life lessons. Like, they probably taught us the lessons, but I also, like, now when I think, there was so much of misinformation I learned from teachers.
I try to brush this privilege a lot. Somebody say something. Not the law. Yeah. 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 What's your name? Mariam. Thank you, Mariam. So Mariam actually gave us a great example, right? And I want to come back to that maybe in our Q&A if we have time. Um, but so I just want to say, I'm very sad Ambika hasn't had a single inspiring teacher. Right? I mean, 12 years, right? අපි අවුරුදු 12ක් ඉස්කෝලේ යනවා. එතකොට එක teacher කෙනෙක්වත් නැත්තම්. So I mean, think about it. If we could have all our teachers to be fabulous, what would that be like, right? අපේ හැම teacher කෙනෙක්ගෙම අපිට subject එක කරන්නේ මේ යම් කිසි දෙයක් විශේෂයෙන් ජීවිතය ගැන, තමන් ගැන, ලෝකෙ ගැන ඉගෙන ගන්න පුළුවන් කොච්චර දෙයක්ද. But I also want to ask, have you asked your teacher how much they pay? Have you? No, right? I haven't either. I never did in my, not just my entire first link, right? How do think සාමාන්‍යයෙන් අපේ අහන්නේ teachers like? I can tell you how much now. If you didn't learn this in the time when the teachers were on strike, right? Guruvaru strike. Guruvaru strike. වෙලාවේ අපි දැනගත්තේ නැත්නම් සාමාන්‍යයෙන් උගන්වන්න පටන් ගන්න කෙනෙක්ට 30,000ක් 40,000ක් තමයි හම්බෙන්නේ. Right? When you start teaching, you get about 30,000-40,000. In the government sector, when you retire after 20 years or something, you may get about 80,000. Right? 40,000ෙන් පටන් අරන් රජයේ සේවය නම් oh dear. Should I shout or can we come? Yeah. විශ්‍රාමය යනකොට 80,000ක් විතර හම්බෙන්න පුළුවන්. Private schools, you may be surprised to know, not too different. And sometimes in the private school, the beginning teacher is government. Right? සමහර වෙලාවට කවුරුත් පාසල් teachers හම්බ වෙන පටි රජයේ සේවයට වඩා අඩු. Right? Does anyone want to go and teach for like the entire for days? To be a teacher in a school? No? Right? Well, okay, so now privatization comes in, right?
Oh dear.
Say privatization. Then, right? පෞද්ගලික කරන්නේ ගැන අපි කතා කරන්න ඕනේ මේ වෙලාවේ. Right? Very අධ්‍යාපනයේ පෞද්ගලික කරන්නේ වෙනකොට රජයේ අධ්‍යාපනයට දානවට වඩා සාමාන්‍ය අපි පුරවැසියෝ යොදනවා. Very simply, when education is privatized, private citizens, we put our money into education far more than the government puts into education. Right? Now, let's take a few examples. Right? Tuition. Best group class, individual teacher, monthly tuition, hammer tuition, right? pay term fees of different amounts. පාසල් යම් පාසල් අවුරුද්දට ගාස්තු ගෙවනවා. We pay donations fee to get into good school, right? යම් හොඳ පාසල ආධාර ලබා දෙනවා ඉස්කෝලේට. Whatever it is, මොනවද කිව්වේ නැති. You give teachers presents, right? So teacher යම් කිසි tag ලබා දෙනවා. මොකද ඒකෙන් කොච්චර ලොකු tag අපිට කියන එක බලපා ගන්නකොට ඊළඟට උසස් අධ්‍යාපනය ගත්තොත්, right? සමහර වෙලාවට පළවෙනි උපාධියටත් ගෙවනවා. එක්කෝ තව වෙනස් උපාධියකටත් ගෙවනවා. එහෙම නැත්නම් අනිත් එකට වඩා යම් කිසි qualification එකක් ලබා ගන්න ඕනේ කියලා ඒකටත් අපි ගෙවනවා, right? We pay sometimes for the first degree, sometimes for a parallel other professional qualification, or for something that makes you get ahead of others, right? So all of that is private funds. Sri Lanka has over 10 public schools, about 90 private schools. We don't know how many international schools because they are registered mostly as companies, sometimes as charities, right? ලංකාවේ 10,000ක් විතර රජයේ පාසල් තියෙනවා. 90ක් විතර පෞද්ගලික පාසල් තියෙනවා. අන්තර්ජාතික පාසල් කියන එක අපි හරියටම දන්නේ නැහැ. ඒවා කොම්පැනි හැටියට තමයි රෙජිස්ටර් වෙන්නේ. එතකොට ගුරුවරු ගත්තාම අපිට ලක්ෂ 2ක් විතර ඉන්නවා රජයේ ගුරුවරු. We have about 2.5 lakhs of state. In the state system we have teachers, and then I'm not really sure how many private school teachers because there are various levels, right? There are full-time teachers, there are teachers for one subject, etc. So you can see there itself the disparity. අද අපිට එකම පේනවා පුරවැසියෝ හැටියට අපිම ගෙවනකොට අධ්‍යාපනයේට ඒක හරිම අසමතුලිතයි. It's very imbalanced. රටක් හැටියට this is not a good thing, right? So කාලයක් තිස්සේ I just want us to remember that for a long time we have been told that we must pay if we want a good education, right? If we want actual education, a real education that shows us, gives us not just the content, but also our values, our ethics, how to be accountable, how to live in a particular way, in a way that is unselfish, that is aware of our privileges. අපිට තියෙන වාසි මොනවාද? අපි වග කියන්නේ කොහොමද සමාජයට මේ ඔක්කොම කරන්න අපිට ගොඩක් කල් තිස්සේ අපේ රජයන් ගණනාවක් කියලා තියෙනවා අපි අපේ අධ්‍යාපනයට බෙදා කරන්න ඕනේ. But why? Why are we spending so much? Is it not the duty, the responsibility of a government to educate its citizens, to give that kind of education that I just described, right? That we want to have inspiring teachers. අපිට ගරු කරන්න පුළුවන් teachersලා ඉන්න අපිට උගන්වන්න කියන්නේ අපි කොහොමද සමාජයේ හැසිරෙන්න ඕනේ කියලා උගන්වන්න අධ්‍යාපන ක්‍රමයක් දෙන එක රජයේ යුතුකමක්, right? So I just also want to say here that for a long time, most Sri Lankan governments have not paid much more than 2% of the budget for education, right? And Ambika just said before this about how the defense budget is going up and up and up, right? අපේ ආරක්ෂක අංශයට ගෙවන අපේ බජට් එකේ තියෙන ප්‍රමාණය සෑහෙන උඩට යනකොට අධ්‍යාපනයට සෞඛ්‍යයට වගේම තියෙන ප්‍රමාණය එන්න අඩු වෙනවා. අපි සාමාන්‍යයෙන් අපේ බජට් එකේ 2% විතර තමයි අපි අධ්‍යාපනයට යොමු කරන්නේ. So let's think about it. right? It's in the interest of selfish leaders to make sure that we are unaware, that we are ignorant, that there is this disparity that then we are spending more, but we are not thinking of their responsibility. අපි කිසිම දෙයක් දන්නේ නැති පුරවැසියෝ හැටියට ඉන්නකොට අපි ඒගොල්ලන්ට එක ලේසි. අපේ රජයන් වලට එක ලේසි. හරි? ඒ කියන්නේ අපි ඒගොල්ලන් දිහා බලන්න ඕනේ නැහැ. අපි ඒගොල්ලන් කරන දේවල් බලාගෙන ඉන්නවා. ඒකම අපි හදනවා අපි කොහොම හරි අධ්‍යාපනයක් ලබා ගන්න. Right? We are complicit in whatever they do, but they would like us to be complicit. Right? And also we like to think about, we like to talk about how wonderful Finland's education is. Whenever I'm in some kind of education forum, I hear this. Finland's education is free, completely. Germany, free higher education, right? But I'm also constantly asked, but we are a poor country, now we are in really dire state. How can we spend as a country on education? And this is something we have to talk about. කොහොමද අපි මයින් ගොඩක් අහනවා ෆින්ලාන්තේ ගාස් නැතුව ගන්නනවා ජර්මනියේ ගාස් නැතුව උසස් අධ්‍යාපනයක් දෙනවා ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ රටේ අයට විතරක් නෙමෙයි පිටරට අපි එහෙට ගියාම right how can we do that අපි කොහොමද ඒක කරන්නේ අපේ රටේ ඉච්චක සල්ලි නැහැ right but we need to ask how has that happened why have we not demanded and when education is privatized, this is very easy for governments to do, to not spend. අධ්‍යාපනයේ පෞද්ගලිකකරණය වෙන්න රජයන්ට හරිම ලේසි අධ්‍යාපනයට පොඩි ගාණක් දෙන්න. right? මේ වගේ කාලෙක කොහොමද අපි අධ්‍යාපනයට වැඩියෙන් රජය ලවා වැය කරවන්න කියන එක ගැන අපි කතා කරන්න ඕනේ. ඉතින් අපි කතා කරමු. So I want to end here. I want us to remember we really urgently need economic reforms and political reforms, right? දේශපාලන විසඳුම් ආර්ථික විසඳුම් අපිට ඉතාමත්ම අවශ්‍යයි. මේ ඇත්තටම අවුරුද්දකට විතර ඉස්සෙල්ලා අවශ්‍යයි, right? But alongside that, we also need reforms of all these other things. We need to look at education, we need to look at health, good public health, good public education. Again, අපි කියන්නේ රාජ්‍ය අධ්‍යාපනය රාජ්‍ය සෞඛ්‍ය වැය කරන ප්‍රමාණය අපි හිතන්න ඕනේ. මොකද especially in a situation where there is austerity, right? අපි ආර්ථික කප්පාදුකම් තියෙන අවස්ථාවේ මේක ගැන අපි කතා කරේ නැත්නම් ඒ රාජ්‍ය සේවයේ තියෙන සෞඛ්‍ය සහ අපි පෞද්ගලිකකරණය වෙච්ච අධ්‍යාපනය ගැන කතා කරේ නැත්නම් අපිට වෙන්නේ තව අපේ තියෙන ප්‍රශ්න තව වැඩි වෙනවා. Even though it is austerity, if we don't talk about the state's responsibility for health and education, right? I want to demand that for health also. In the face of austerity, our social issues will become worse. So I just want to say here, can we please, while we are asking for economic reforms and political reforms, also ask for money from the government for better education, right? අපි ඉල්ලමු දේශපාලන විසඳුම් ආර්ථික විසඳුම් තියෙද්දී ඒ එක්කම මේ වැටීගෙන යන අධ්‍යාපනයටත් විසඳුමක් මොකද ආර්ථික විසඳුම් ආර්ථික ප්‍රශ්නයක් ආර්ථික අර්බුදයක් අපිට ඇඟට දැනෙනවා. We feel it in our bodies, right? When there is an economic crisis. That's why we all here. ඒක අපි ඔක්කොම මෙතන ඉන්නේ. goal phase එකේ ඉන්නේ. But a crisis in education is not something you feel like that, right? අධ්‍යාපනයේ අර්බුදය අපිට දැනෙන්නේ නැහැ. It's like a cancer. You don't see it till the end. කියන්නේ පිළිකාවක් වගේ අන්තිම වෙනකල් දැනෙන්නේ නැති තැන. So let's talk about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you both. I mean, we postponed this on Sunday to escape the rain, but it seems the rain is following us. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. So if anyone has questions, please, for either of them. Okay. Can you?
Yeah.
So I have like three questions. We'll change one because of the time. Two is to Ambika and one is to Kaushalya. So yeah.
Ambika first, I think,
Yeah.
because she's